Do you want to know the fastest way to recognize if you're in a cult? In this video, I'm going to tell you the 4 definitive ways to recognize the cult dynamic so you can understand how they're structured. I learnt this from an amazing man who's considered the world's foremost expert on cults, mind control, and destructive organizations because I needed to know what happened to me. And a few years ago, when I started speaking out about spiritual abuse and I made a couple of videos, I had no idea until recently that those videos actually inspired people to leave fundamentalist extremist cults. They told me how clarifying it was to hear that information because they honestly weren't aware. And that's an important point that I want to make is that when you're in it, you don't know it. Something just feels off. It's like when you don't know you're in a relationship with a narcissist until you do. Hi, I'm Joanna Kujath. I'm a transformational mentor and the author of Unveiling the Narcissist. I took a break off YouTube, but I'm back now. So you could really help me by liking this video and leaving me a comment to let the algorithm know because apparently that's important for the platform. But please also leave me your details in case YouTube decides to censor me again because I might say something that questions the mainstream narrative. And also, if you'd like to register your interest in my intensive program, masterclasses, or private mentoring, you'll find all the links in the description box below. Many victims of narcissistic abuse, in their vulnerability, get drawn into cults. They don't necessarily need to be religious, but have a similar dynamic. There's always some sort of hierarchy to climb, approval to gain, sales to make until you're worthy. Narcissists create their own cults and call it family. You've probably noticed how they have special terms and phrases to make us feel special, superior, or bonded in a dysfunctional way. It's us against the world, and we don't realize we're being isolated. The narcissist family cult is difficult to exit from. There are layers of indoctrination that we were trained to believe to be normal and forms of abuse we had to accept in order to belong. After personally experiencing the difficulties of exiting a cult, after being born into one, I had no idea of any other reality than what they told me, and I was not allowed to have any other outside interests. What I found really helpful was Stephen Hassan's BITE model of authoritarian control. It stands for behavior, information, thought, and emotional control. Can you see how that pattern is basically the same as being in a relationship with a narcissist? Cults like to control these 4 areas: the way we behave, what we think about, how we feel, and what type of information we have access to. Cults, like narcissists, like to dispense their version of truth as the only version of reality. We are often vulnerable to these dysfunctional dynamics because of previous conditioning. Before, the head of the family was a narcissistic father. The boss of the relationship was the husband, or the narcissistic wife who held the reins. All these commonly used phrases indicate someone in a superior position whose control is justified just by their role. That's why narcissists love cults. The structure allows them to continue their tyrannical ways, and it rewards them for it. In a cult setting, we have to blindly surrender to the guru, despite his words and actions not matching at all. The 4 ways to identify you're in a cult is behavior. Do they need you to behave in certain ways? With narcissists, this is an easy one to answer because they're always needing to make a public performance, make a good impression. So our behavior is always monitored because it reflects on them. The next one is information. Are you only allowed to look at information they approve of? Is it discouraged to be curious about anything outside what they want your attention on? Is the information controlled, dispensed, or withheld from you? The third aspect is thoughts. Are you allowed to think about certain things and are threatened or not allowed to think about anything else? Do you feel like you're being mind controlled, brainwashed? Psychologically, I felt like I was a hostage. I was in a mental prison. I was bored out of my mind because the information was so repetitive. Many people in cults end up with mental illness as a result of this thought policing. And the fourth way is emotions. Do you feel like your emotions are being controlled? Are certain emotions allowed or not allowed? It's interesting to observe the hypocrisy, how the narcissist can get into a rage, but then you're not allowed to feel angry. You are forced to feel happy despite inwardly suppressing sadness, anger, or frustration. There's an emotional fakeness you see in cults and dysfunctional families. They put it on, that sickly sweet concern, but just as quickly they can shun you and reject you and withdraw their forged display of love if you disobey. This emotional control is a recipe for emotional dysregulation and emotional illiteracy because we don't know our own emotions. The word alluring means tempting, charming, and seductive promises of something bigger, better, more, and one day in the future. When we are emotionally vulnerable, our open heartedness is like a beacon to these predators. They are experts at selling us a dream. When we buy the dream that they're selling, we may be escaping or avoiding facing what's actually going on in our life. Entering these types of fantasy relationships helps us deny or distract us from our own terror of being alone or our fear of being abandoned, which are core wounds. We emotionally invest our energy in a fantasy that's been deliberately sold to us. It's an exploitation of our innocence. This future faking is commonly utilized by narcissists and a familiar way to recruit unsuspecting sheep into a cult flock. Be aware when they sell you a dream. They wrap it up in exactly the colors and ribbons we love, and the dangling of the carrot continues, but in another guise. It's all based on promises and a rushed intimacy. These groups make us feel like we belong to a family we may have longed for. It's when they paint perfect scenarios of a future in order to get what they want in the present, which is our blind obedience. We become emotionally invested and often financially as well. It takes some time to notice that they tend to overpromise and underdeliver. But by then, we're already invested too much. And we deny that we may be becoming terrified that this will all lead to disappointment and heartbreak. We fear our beliefs might not be the only true way. Sects, religious denominations, spiritual cliques are the perfect environment for narcissists to justify their pathological control and continue their abuse under the guise of being spiritual. I didn't see the correlation, the familiar patterns of persuasion, all different flavors of the same thing, exploitation. Another thing to notice is they don't encourage individuality or critical thinking because it's seen as a threat. So they encourage a herd mentality and a hive mind. And just like a dysfunctional family, there's too much we and not enough me. It's all based on enmeshment and propagated by fear of punishment, fear of being rejected by the group, and shunned and shamed publicly. I didn't realize that the spiritual abuse we encounter is the most wounding of all. In these types of enticing settings, reality is distorted. They are settings to attract the traumatized who are unhealed, who are vulnerable, and more easily exploited and influenced. Once someone realizes what has been done to them, they can get stuck in blame and hate, demanding why someone could be so cruel to be able to be so manipulative. And the harsh answer is because they can. Once you understand your strengths and weaknesses, you'll be able to identify manipulation sooner, and this knowledge will be protective. Manipulators seek only a certain type of person to manipulate. They look for vulnerabilities, especially emotional vulnerabilities. The oppression we live under is indescribable. It affects our mind and infects our connection to the divine. They'll use their version of God to threaten and intimidate you. Needless to say, many of us completely reject the notion of God and spirituality. How could God have abandoned me when I needed him most? Why did he turn a blind eye all those years I was abused, neglected, and utterly heartbroken? I developed a despise towards anything to do with religion. I chose to disconnect because my spirituality was poisoned by what the narcissist dispensed. This is a form of self erasure. You erase yourself. It's a manipulation of free will. I didn't know how I was slowly coerced by these experiences to entirely reject the whole notion of spirituality. And of course, I didn't know back then that dogmatic religious practices are not the same as spirituality. I've learnt to lower my defenses and can now see the wisdom in all ancient esoteric traditions. They're all interpretations of the same thing. I was definitely tired of existing in the lower emotional ranges of guilt, fear, and shame, which I now call kindergarten spirituality. Surely God wanted me to feel joy, infinite support, and divine love. But somehow in a cult, all of that was always out of reach. It took a long time to accept that my emotional suffering was guidance, telling me something. The pain of disconnection from divinity was actually a call toward it.